The invasion did not begin with gunfire. It began with a logistical impossibility. On the morning of D-Day, thousands of ships crossed the English Channel carrying the largest invasion force in history. Soldiers landed. Vehicles rolled onto the sand. Commanders established positions. On paper, the invasion had succeeded. In reality, it was already in danger. An army does not exist because men arrive. It exists because supplies keep coming. And on the Normandy coast, there was nowhere for that flow to begin. No harbor, no docks, no cranes. Only open beach exposed to tides, weather, and enemy fire. Every modern army runs on weight. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies. Without them, movement slows. Without movement, momentum dies. Normandy offered no natural solution. Ships could approach, but they could not unload at the scale required. Small landing craft were not enough. Time was already working against the invasion. The plan assumed speed. Millions of tons of material had to come ashore quickly, continuously, without interruption. Any delay would stack up on the beach, turning order into congestion. Congestion into vulnerability. Vulnerability into collapse. German commanders understood this. They had fortified the ports precisely because ports were the key. Capture one too slowly, and the invasion starves. Fail to capture one at all, and the invasion dies quietly, not in a dramatic defeat, but in paralysis. This created a brutal paradox. The invasion needed a port to survive, but every port worth having was heavily defended. The Allies could land troops on beaches, but they could not land a war there. Firepower could not solve this. Bombing could destroy docks, but destruction did not create capacity. Naval guns could suppress defenses, but they could not create infrastructure. The coastline would remain what it was, an edge, not an entrance. For a brief moment, the entire campaign balanced on an unspoken question. What happens if the war arrives faster than the ability to support it? This is where traditional thinking failed. Armies had always moved toward ports. Supply followed capture. Normandy reversed that logic. The Allies had to capture territory first and invent logistics afterward. That meant accepting a reality most military planners avoided. The most dangerous phase of the invasion would not be the landings. It would be what came after, when the beachhead existed but could not breathe. Without a solution, the invasion would stall within days. Tanks would stop, artillery would fall silent, infantry would dig in and wait. And waiting favors the defender. The war did not need a heroic breakthrough. It needed somewhere to stand. And that realization forced a radical shift in thinking. Instead of asking how to take a port, planners asked a more unsettling question. What if the port did not exist until the war created it? That question led to an answer so unnatural that it sounded absurd. Instead of conquering infrastructure, they would manufacture it. Instead of adapting to the coastline, they would overwrite it. They would not fight their way into a harbor. They would bring one with them. Not later, not after the battle, but while the invasion was still hanging in the balance. The Allies did not face a German army first. They faced physics. Normandy had no usable port, no deep-water harbor, no cranes, no docks. Every ton of fuel, ammunition, food, and vehicles had to come across an exposed shoreline. Ships could not unload fast enough. Trucks could not move supplies inland fast enough. And the sea did not wait. In modern war, an army without supplies does not retreat. It collapses. Tanks without fuel are just steel boxes. Soldiers without ammunition are spectators. Artillery without shells is noise without effect. The invasion timetable assumed millions of tons of material flowing ashore within days. Without a port, that timetable was fantasy. The Germans understood this weakness. They fortified every major harbor along the French coast. If the Allies captured a port late, the invasion would starve before it could break out. If they captured none, the invasion would fail entirely. This was the paradox. The invasion needed a port to succeed, but the invasion could not succeed without already having one. No firepower could solve that. No bombing campaign could change the shape of the coastline. The solution was not to take a port, it was to bring one. Not a temporary pier, not a small dock, a full-scale, working seaport, with breakwaters to calm the waves, with piers strong enough for cargo ships, with floating roadways that trucks could drive on as if the sea were solid ground. And it had to be assembled while the battle was still being fought, while artillery shells were landing, while aircraft were attacking, while men were dying on the beach. This was not engineering for comfort. It was engineering for survival, and it would only work if every piece was designed to move, fit, and lock together without delay. Time was the enemy now, and time never missed, turning impossibility into a system. You do not build a miracle by improvising. You build it by removing choice. The idea of bringing a port across the sea only worked if it stopped being an idea and became a system. Every part had to be decided in advance. Every mistake had to be eliminated before the first piece ever touched water. There would be no second chances on the Normandy coast. Traditional ports take years because they are built in place. They are customized to geography, weather, and traffic. Mulberry could not be. It had to function anywhere, under any condition, immediately. That meant abandoning perfection and embracing repetition. The solution was standardization on a scale never attempted before. Instead of designing one port, planners designed thousands of identical parts: massive concrete breakwaters, floating steel roadways, pier heads that rose and fell with the tide. Each component was useless on its own. Together, they formed a machine. Concrete became the first gamble. The breakwaters were not poured on the French coast. They were cast in British shipyards, docks, and rivers. Entire neighborhoods watched as enormous hollow structures took shape, each weighing thousands of tons. They were not meant to move fast. They were meant to survive storms. Steel was the second gamble. The floating roadways had to bend without breaking. Rigid structures would snap under wave action. Flexible ones risked collapse under weight. Engineers settled on a design that behaved more like a living organism than a bridge. It flexed. It absorbed shock. It adapted. Every bolt, every joint, every hinge was tested not for elegance, but for abuse. Could it be dropped? Could it be misaligned? Could it still work when assembled by exhausted men under fire? If the answer was no, it was redesigned or discarded. Nothing was optimized for beauty. Everything was optimized for speed. While factories worked day and night, another problem loomed: assembly. A port is not a puzzle you solve calmly. On D-Day, assembly would happen while shells landed and aircraft attacked. That meant the men building it could not be civilians. They could not stop when conditions became dangerous. This is where builders became soldiers. Construction units trained to assemble massive structures while wearing helmets instead of hard hats. They learned to read blueprints while listening for incoming fire. They learned to operate cranes with one eye on the sea and one eye on the sky. The process was rehearsed again and again, not on beaches, but in mines. Each crew knew exactly where to go, what to attach, and what would fail if they hesitated. There was no room for debate once the operation began. When the invasion started, the sea did not cooperate. Storms rolled in. Waves smashed against unfinished sections. Some components broke free. Others sank. One entire harbor would later be destroyed by weather alone. And yet, the system held. Not because it was indestructible, but because it was redundant. If one roadway failed, another replaced it. If one pier was damaged, cargo shifted elsewhere. The port did not rely on a single structure surviving. It relied on enough of them surviving. This was the true innovation. The Mulberry was not built to last forever. It was built to last long enough to feed an army, long enough to fuel tanks, long enough to move the invasion inland. Trucks rolled off ships as if the beach had always been a harbor. Fuel flowed, ammunition stacked, vehicles moved forward. The war finally had somewhere to stand. German artillery continued to fire. Aircraft continued to attack, but they were now aiming at a moving target. A port that could be repaired faster than it could be destroyed. A system that absorbed damage and kept functioning. This was not engineering as construction. This was engineering as warfare. The men assembling the port did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as solving a problem before it solved them. Every hour the port functioned meant thousands of soldiers would not go hungry. Every day it stood meant the invasion would not stall. By the time the fighting moved inland, the most dangerous phase was already over. Not on the battlefield, but on the shoreline where concrete, steel, and time had decided whether the invasion lived or died. The Allies did not defeat the sea. They negotiated with it. They did not outgun physics. They worked around it. And in doing so, they proved something modern warfare would never forget. Victory belongs to the side that can turn impossibility into routine faster than the enemy can react. When the sea tried to end the war, the greatest enemy of the Mulberry was never German artillery. It was the weather. For days after D-Day, the artificial ports did exactly what they were built to do. Ships unloaded, trucks rolled forward, fuel flowed inland. The invasion stabilized. What had begun as a gamble was turning into a routine, and that was precisely when the sea intervened. In mid-June, a storm swept across the English Channel with a violence few had predicted. Waves rose higher than expected. Winds pushed relentlessly against the floating structures. The very flexibility that allowed the Mulberry to function under normal conditions was now tested beyond its limits. Concrete caissons shifted, floating roadways twisted, anchor lines snapped. What had been engineered for speed and adaptability now faced raw force, hour after hour, without pause. One harbor failed. Mulberry A, the American harbor at Omaha Beach, began to break apart. Sections collided, roadways tore loose, piers were damaged beyond repair. By the time the storm passed, the port was effectively destroyed. The gamble had lost one half of its bet. This was the moment when the entire invasion could have unraveled. Without a functioning harbor, supply rates would drop, vehicles would back up on the beaches, ammunition would slow, fuel would run short. The Germans did not need to counterattack. They only needed to wait. But something unexpected happened. The invasion did not collapse. The Allies made a decision that revealed the true logic behind the Mulberry concept. They did not rebuild Mulberry A. They abandoned it, salvaged what they could, redirected everything to Mulberry B, the British harbor at Gold Beach. This was not failure. This was design working as intended. Mulberry was never meant to be a single point of success. It was meant to provide margin, redundancy, options. When one port died, the other absorbed the load. Cargo ships rerouted. Landing schedules adjusted. The system bent, but did not break. Engineers and construction crews worked continuously, repairing damage, reinforcing weak points, replacing broken sections with spares that had been built months earlier for exactly this scenario. There was no panic, no improvisation. The decisions had already been made long before the storm arrived. The sea had removed the illusion of control. What remained was preparation. Within days, Mulberry B was handling more traffic than originally planned. More ships, more vehicles, more supplies. What should have been a catastrophic failure became a demonstration of resilience. The harbor stood not because it was invincible, but because it was flexible enough to survive loss. German forces continued to shell the beaches. Aircraft still attacked, but the critical moment had passed. The invasion now had momentum. Supplies flowed inland faster than the Germans could disrupt them. The port had done its job. This was the quiet victory. Not the storm itself, but what happened after. Wars are not won by plans that never fail. They are won by systems that continue functioning after failure occurs. Mulberry proved that survival in modern warfare depends less on preventing disaster and more on absorbing it. By late June, the artificial harbor was no longer a miracle. It was infrastructure. Trucks drove across floating roadways without hesitation. Crews repaired damage as if it were routine maintenance. What had once seemed impossible had become normal, and that was the most dangerous moment of all. Because once something becomes normal, it stops being noticed. The men unloading ships under fire were no longer part of a daring experiment. They were simply keeping the war moving. The builders faded into the background, even as they carried the invasion forward hour by hour. The storm had revealed the truth behind the Mulberry. It was not a triumph over nature. It was an acceptance of uncertainty. The Allies did not defeat the sea. They planned for its betrayal. And by doing so, they ensured that when the beachhead expanded and the fighting moved inland, the most fragile phase of the invasion had already been survived. The war now had depth. It had weight. It had momentum. And all of it rested on a port that was never meant to exist. The moment the supply lines stabilized, the outcome of the campaign was no longer a mystery. After the storm, after the losses, after the repairs, the invasion crossed an invisible threshold. It no longer depended on survival. It depended on momentum, and momentum belongs to the side that can move faster, supply more, and recover sooner. With a functioning port in place, the battlefield expanded inland. Tanks did not wait for fuel. Artillery did not ration shells. Infantry units did not pause for lack of food or medical support. Every day, thousands of tons of material moved off the beaches and into France. This was where the real imbalance appeared. German forces fought with skill and experience, but they fought on a shrinking logistical island. Their supply lines were fragile, vulnerable to air attack, and stretched across occupied territory. Replacements arrived late. Fuel arrived inconsistently. Ammunition shortages became routine. The Allies fought a different war. Losses were replaced. Equipment was repaired or replaced within days. Units rotated. Wounded soldiers were evacuated and treated. The system absorbed punishment without collapsing. This asymmetry did not show up in dramatic moments. It appeared quietly, in daily operations. A tank battalion advancing when another would have stopped. An artillery barrage continuing when another would have gone silent. A bridge repaired overnight instead of weeks later. These advantages accumulated. Each one was small. Together, they were decisive. The Mulberry Harbor was only one part of this machine, but it was the part that made everything else possible. It transformed an exposed coastline into a stable rear area. It turned chaos into flow. It converted a beachhead into an engine. By the time Allied forces broke out of Normandy, the invasion was no longer a gamble. It was an industrial process. Supplies moved on schedules. Movements were planned weeks ahead. The war had entered a phase where outcome followed capacity. German commanders recognized the shift. They understood that even successful tactical defenses could not reverse the strategic reality. Every day the Allies remained ashore. Their strength increased. Every day the Germans delayed. Their position weakened. This is the moment history often misreads. We remember battles. We remember breakthroughs. We remember flags raised and cities liberated. But those events were consequences, not causes. The cause was flow. Once flow was established, the war in Western Europe became a problem of time, not possibility. The Allies did not need to win every fight. They needed to keep moving. And they could, because their infrastructure moved with them. The men who built and maintained the port rarely appeared in photographs. Their work did not create moments of victory. It created continuity. And continuity is what wins long wars. As the front advanced, new ports were captured. New supply routes opened. The artificial harbor became less critical, then obsolete. That did not diminish its importance. It confirmed its purpose. It had filled the gap between landing and expansion. In that gap, entire campaigns can fail. The Mulberry succeeded because it existed only to bridge a moment of maximum vulnerability. Once that moment passed, it had already done its job. The Allies did not defeat Germany in a single operation. They overwhelmed it with capacity, with movement, with a system that grew stronger over time, while the enemy's options narrowed. And that system began on a beach where concrete and steel arrived before certainty did. The quiet rule that decides wars. Wars are remembered by who advanced. They are decided by who could keep moving. By the time the fighting moved deep into France, the artificial harbor had already faded from attention. New ports were captured. Roads stretched inland. Rail lines were repaired. The front expanded, and with it, the memory of how fragile everything once was. But that, forgetting, is part of the lesson. The most important systems in war disappear the moment they succeed. When infrastructure works, it is invisible. When it fails, history notices. The Mulberry Harbor did not win battles. It removed limits. It did not defeat the enemy. It made defeat inevitable. Once the Allies proved they could create stability on an open coast, the question was no longer whether they could win, but how long it would take. This marked a permanent shift in warfare. From that point forward, Military power was no longer measured only by weapons or manpower. It was measured by the ability to build, repair, and replace faster than destruction could occur. Engineers became strategists. Builders became force multipliers. Construction schedules became battle plans. The distinction between the front line and the rear began to dissolve. The men who assembled the port under fire did not appear in victory parades. Their success left no dramatic images. It left continuity. It left momentum. It left a war that could not be starved back into the sea. Modern conflicts still follow the same rule. Armies advance until their systems break. They retreat when they can no longer move fuel, food, or ammunition. Firepower creates pressure. Infrastructure decides endurance. Normandy taught this lesson in concrete and steel, not through a single moment of brilliance, but through days of uninterrupted function under stress. The harbor stood long enough, and long enough was all that mattered. In the end, the most powerful weapon of the invasion was not carried by a soldier. It floated offshore, assembled piece by piece, absorbing damage, refusing collapse. The war did not turn because of one battle. It turned because an army found a way to stand where it should not have been able to stand. And the question history leaves behind is not about the past. It is about the future. In a world where wars move faster and systems are more complex, who will build what cannot fail fast enough to matter?